Have you started recording yet? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Hey guys, so just gonna make a start. So I'm just gonna go through microcirculation and lymphatic system. It's a fairly straightforward part of heart physiology because it's just talking about your capillaries and lymphatic system. So firstly, talking about capillaries, this is just the main like you need to know what's the structure of capillaries, right? So um, they actually have pericytes, which are like contractile cells located outside the outer surface of the capillary wall. So that actually allows it to expand or like dilate or constrict. And then you've got sphincters, basically to allow for blood flow. So if you look at this diagram, if you close if the sphincter is closed, then less blood can actually flow through the capillaries, but if it's open, more blood can flow through, basically. And it just allows for exchange of diffusible substances. So because capillaries are very thin, there's slow blood flow, it has a total large surface area, and it's very thin walls. So yeah, this is just the capillaries. So there's the different types of capillaries. There's continuous, fenestrated, and sinusoidal. So continuous capillaries are the most common. So it's basically your basement membrane of your capillary wall is continuous. It's a continuous layer, and it's just joined by tight junctions. Whereas fenestrated, you'll find it in certain areas of your body, like your gut, endocrine glands, and it's just basically when there's interruptions, like small fenestrations, like holes in your layer. And sinusoidal is when there's even larger holes. So there's big, huge gaps in the walls which allow the passage of whole cells to pass through between blood and tissue. Yeah, so there's two types of forces in capillary pressure. There's like oncotic and hydrostatic. So this determines the flow of substances within the capillary. So oncotic pressure is just basically when there's a pull towards an area with more proteins, and hydrostatic is looking at your water pressure. So what's happening is that so as your capillary as blood passes through your capillary, there's filtration. So your fluid actually exits the capillary and into your tissues because there's higher hydrostatic pressure in your capillary compared to your tissues. And after a point, the hydrostatic is equal to the blood. So there's no net movement. And after that, fluid re-enters the capillary because your capillary hydrostatic pressure is less than the blood. So the main pressure is your hydrostatic, and what influences your hydrostatic is your oncotic. Yeah. So in this region where there's reabsorption, there's greater oncotic pressure because there's greater proteins, albumin, whatever not, compared to your blood outside. Yeah, your tissue area. Okay, so moving on. Interstitium is basically the space between cells. So it's just basically made out of collagen and proteoglycans, and water doesn't actually move easily through this. So if there's too much of water, it causes pitting edema. So pitting edema is like when you press in and then it indents. So that's just because water takes time to re-enter the space, right? Whereas non-pitting edema is due to other substances that you can't push water out of. So like if you have thyroid diseases, but you don't really have to learn that right now. So interstitium, so that's the main point of your lymphatic system. So the lymphatic systems basically collect your fluid in tissues and return it back to the vein. Okay, so your lymph nodes have, like, your lymph system has like various functions. It's to collect fluid, it's to have lymph nodes throughout the body to prevent spread of bad things like pathogens. And there's just a few key terms that you take note of. So lymphedema is just when the lymphatics don't work properly, and then that just causes swelling. And then lymphangitis is inflammation of the lymph vessels, and lymphangitis, carcinoma means cancer. Yeah. Okay, so there can, when your lymphatic system doesn't work properly, when there's an infection, your lymphatic system actually spreads the disease, and this causes edema. So firstly, two things. So your liver actually stops producing albumin, which is like a protein. So when you stop producing protein, that affects your oncotic pressure. So your capillary oncotic pressure decreases, and
Sorry?
Sorry, do you want to mute X? Okay. So yeah, so as I was saying, the liver stops producing protein. So when there's a reduction in the number of protein, your capillary oncotic pressure decreases. So this causes fluid to actually flow out into the interstitium, and this causes edema. Okay. Yeah, and you can't treat it just by giving more albumin, because your vessels are leaky, and this can just end up just worsening the whole situation actually. So a second reason that causes edema is due to sepsis from bacteria. So sepsis actually causes hypotension and tachycardia. And so while your arterial resistance decreases, the capillaries are exposed to the pressure that is usually mitigated by your arteries. And that causes your hydrostatic pressure capillaries to go up, and that causes the blood fluid to leak out of your capillaries into the interstitium. And that again causes edema. Oh, is that it? I think that's yeah, that's the last part of the set.
Sweet.
All right, yeah, it's not too complicated. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, cool. Good night. Okay.
Good night.
All right. We might go into Kahoot, I think. Yeah, we'll do Kahoot. Because I don't think there's too much to cover this week. But how were the ECG tubes, guys? Like the ECG workshops? I'm showing the screen, right?
This must be how the anatomy tutors feel. Nobody replies.
Wait, for which one?
Oh, you asked how the ECG tubes were, but nobody's replying.
Oh, it's okay. ECG coaches.
Oh, I love that.
It was long. Yeah, it was long. Anyway.
Yeah, it was long, but did it make sense? Is a real question.
I don't actually remember what happened in those sessions. Like, I think I didn't really do anything.
Yeah, I just remember like running around, like activating the room. I love running around in there.
Yeah, that was like every single session though. That was like,
That was so much fun. Have you guys gone through coronary arteries and stuff?
easy. I don't know.
Peasy lemon squeezy.
Yeah. ECG. I don't know, ECG is a weird one. I feel like, I don't know, ECG takes a while to get through to your head.
But also at the same time, Monash doesn't expect very much from you. Like you just need to be able to identify, wow, that's a ST elevated MI, and that's it.
I mean, they might get you to identify which coronary artery it is. So. 3 hours is ridiculous. Make it stop there. Oh my goodness. How do you do 3 hours? Ours was never 3 hours. A bunch of these questions are like multi-select, so don't submit too early. Sweet. Yeah, so the main tricky ones, I guess, was just remembering that it protects the superior abdominal organs. I guess like the liver is the biggest one, plus a bit of your spleen, like the top half of your kidneys. That's all I can think of. But yeah, it does protect some of the abdominal ones. The lower ones aren't protected at all. But yeah, good job. Yeah, good. Yeah, so remembering that although you have a costal groove where all the structures are held, the intercostal nerve is the most exposed, and that's on the inferior side of the rib. So what most people do, or they'll try to do, is they'll try to avoid these structures and instead either just sacrifice the collateral branches, which are on the superior side of the rib, or just like go straight through the middle. Yeah, so as Zoe said in the chat, the arrangement from superior to inferior within the costal groove is the vein, artery, and the nerve. So the nerve's the most exposed and therefore the most at danger. And they supply like the intercostal muscles, which you need for breathing. Yeah, good. I think there's another question about this after this, so I'll explain it then. Yeah, good. So foam cells. Okay, good. So I'll explain the LDL HDL thing. So these are types of cholesterols. They would have come up in like semester 1, good memories from biochem. But LDL is kind of bad because it takes your cholesterol and deposits it within your arteries, whereas HDL is kind of good because it takes it from those arteries, it takes them away. So LDL is the one that damages it, and it kind of forms that fatty streak and the fatty plaque, and atherosclerosis, and then HDL is kind of protective against it. So the way LDL kind of stays there occurs after macrophages swallow it up, and then they kind of get stuck in the walls, and that's where they turn into foam cells. Apparently because they look foamy. So yeah, too many foam cells, and that is bad. Yeah, good. Good. So this one here is kind of referring to it's a really acute onset rather than like slow onset angina, where you get like slow occlusion of the arteries. That's the difference between red and yellow here. So red kind of explains the really acute onset, where it's fine for most of the time until it bursts and then the blood gets stuck there and then you get a full occlusion of the coronary arteries. Whereas yellow, like this is probably happening before this whole scenario happened. He probably would have felt pretty short of breath when walking for long places. He might have gotten some calf pain. Probably wasn't in the greatest of shape. So yeah. Also, yeah, just like I think impending sense of death is pretty, like sometimes they use it as a buzzword, I think. Yeah, that's always no fun. And it's a crushing chest pain. Yeah. Yeah, good. So tissue plasminogen activator is basically an artificial form of plasmin, or it kind of activates plasmin. And the role of plasmin is to break down fibrin clots. So we call this a thrombolytic agent. So it kind of dissolves your clots just into liquid. And that's different from like an anticoagulant or like an antiplatelet, which is what red is referring to. So those are things like, the only thing you would have learned so far is like aspirin. That's kind of what red would be for. But yeah, TPA is to break down clots. I think you'll be talking about and lipid lowering drugs, I think next week. Yeah, and then we'll cover it then. But yeah, in this case, it's to break down the clots. Good. Yeah, so once again, cardiac troponin here is the only one that's only found in cardiac muscles. Like C-reactive protein is just a general inflammation marker, so it doesn't have to be in your heart. Cardiac myosin is not a marker that we use. And then myoglobin is also found elsewhere. I'm pretty sure like in your muscles. So it's not specific to your heart, whereas cardiac troponin is, and that's why it's good. Yeah, so yeah, the heart is one of those organs that can't kind of regenerate itself. So that means once you damage it and you can't do anything about it, which is why if you have a lot of ischemia or if a lot of the cells die, then you get a bit of heart failure. And that's because your cells can't contract. They can't contract properly, and therefore you kind of get a backlog of fluid and blood, which is pretty bad. Yeah, so it's unable to regenerate its cardiomyocytes. Yeah, so I guess this is an important thing for embryology, and Lazarus will go on and on about it for the phrenic nerve. So the phrenic nerve kind of surrounds the pericardium, right? C345 keeps the diaphragm alive. And that's because the heart drags C345 all the way down into the thoracic area. So C345 are all cervical. So for C345 to get like down into your thorax region, it would have had to be dragged down. And that's why it starts off cervical and ends up thoracic. Yeah, embryology matters. Oh, yeah. And C345 is fifth. Good job. Yeah, good. So, yeah, during development, the fetal lungs don't work, and neither do the livers, which is why you have to bypass it, because it's only once you're born where your lungs kind of work. That's like the further deep breath in, and then the liver actually filters blood and things like that. Forgetting a bit of it, but I'm pretty sure it shunts it through the liver, through like the
ductus venosus.
Yep. Wait, sorry, what was that?
The ductus venosus, which eventually becomes the ligamentum venosum, and then the lungs is the arteriosum. What was it? It becomes ligamentum arteriosum, but it used to be the, what's that called again?
Ductus arteriosus.
I think so, yes.
Yep. I think there's a question later on it. So yeah, we'll get to it then. Yeah, so liver and lungs, the two doubles, is what it bypasses. There you go. Whoops. Yeah, good. So yeah, as Zoe was saying, ductus arteriosus, which helps to bypass the lungs, should turn into the ligamentum arteriosum. And this is kind of located on the arch of the aorta. And this is a really important landmark. The exams love it because it's a pretty significant landmark for the left recurrent laryngeal nerve, which is a branch of the vagus nerve. And if you damage that one, then you kind of get hoarse voice and perhaps a bit short of breath as well. In abnormal development, you could get patent ductus arteriosus, which as the name suggests, it's where your ductus arteriosus remains patent. So it remains open and it doesn't close up and form the ligamentum arteriosum. Yeah. I don't know if you guys covered this, but I forgot to study it last year and it came up on the exam. So, yeah. Yeah, good. So it's everything. So it's a congenital condition. The babies are normally blue, so they're cyanotic. And that's because you're kind of mixing your deoxygenated blood with your oxygenated blood. So the way I like to think of it is starting with like pulmonary stenosis. So your pulmonary artery comes out of your right side of the heart. And since it's stenosis, it's kind of more difficult to open, and therefore your right ventricle kind of has to work harder to push blood into this pulmonary artery. So that kind of explains your pulmonary stenosis and your right ventricular hypertrophy. Ventricular septal defect is it's essentially a hole between the right and the left ventricles, which means that when your right ventricle kind of contracts, instead of that blood going into the pulmonary circulation, instead it'll just bypass it and go straight into the left ventricle and out into the systemic circulation, which is where you get a lot of mixing of blood, mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. And an overriding aorta is kind of where it connects to both the right and the left ventricle. And once again, mixing of blood into the systemic circulation. Yeah, so it's a good 4 things to remember. And normally those will be picked up at birth, but apparently it is possible that it isn't.
Oh, yeah, and another buzzword for the tetralogy of Fallot thing is boot-shaped heart on X-ray.
Yeah, good. So ankle swelling indicates kind of right heart failure, because if your right heart isn't working properly, then it'll back up into the systemic circulation, and you'll get ankle swelling, which is why you ask it in your cardio histories, and that's why you also check for it, or you check for like sacral edema in like your cardio exams. And then last question. I'm pretty sure you guys have covered this. I hope. Yeah, good. Yeah, so cardiac output is equal to both red and blue. So stroke volume times BPM, where stroke volume is in liters. Yeah, kind of liters per stroke. And then BPM is just beats per minute. And then cardiac output is just venous return, because you have to have an equal amount of blood coming into the heart and going out of the heart. Otherwise, you get a backlog of fluid, and that's no good. End diastolic volume minus end systolic volume is referring to stroke volume. And then green I just made up. That doesn't equal anything. Yeah, hopefully that helped. Yeah, I think that's pretty good. So good job to everyone. Good job to sad face, who shouldn't be sad. Yeah, 14 out of 14. Good job, guys. Yeah, good job. Does anyone have any questions from those questions? I kind of forgot what else we have to cover. Is there much stuff for coronary circulation, Zoe?
It's pretty tiny. Yeah.
What was that? You're muted.
Yeah, okay, now I'll go now.
Okay.
There's not very much to it, so.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Oh, wait, that's not. Wait, can you see my screen? Okay, yes. So as I said here, coronary circulation, I don't even know if you guys are doing this. Was it a lecture or was it an active learning? I can't remember.
I feel like this was active learning.
Yeah, it was an active learning, which basically means nobody really listened and there was nothing really covered in the active learning. But it's basically just talking about the coronary circulation, which so I basically made these notes. I don't even know if it's related. So the coronary circulation refers to the circulation system supplying and draining the heart. And obviously this is important because I didn't actually know this, but the heart actually needs blood. So the heart needs a coronary, like an arterial supply, because it has a high metabolic requirements. It pumps a lot, it supplies all the vessels in the body, and like, yeah, it needs blood. So it needs oxygen. You guys have already been through the coronary arteries, right? Okay, I'm just going to assume the answer to that is yes. But the coronary arteries are actually very, very important. This is actually very high yield. You need to know what the main coronary arteries are, what the main branches are, and what area each coronary artery supplies. So I don't even know if I put this here. Yeah, I think this was covered under anatomy, but basically just recapping, the right coronary artery, so that one right there, has two main branches that you need to know. So the first one is the right marginal artery. So that kind of supplies like the side, a segment of the right ventricle. And then there's the posterior descending interventricular artery. So that's the one that goes behind. And hopefully you guys have talked about right and left dominance in anatomy. That's basically just talking about which artery, so right or left, supply to that posterior descending interventricular/interventricular artery. And there's also the left coronary artery. Oh, is it intraventricular or interventricular? I think it's intra. Okay, I'll fix that later. It was inter. I can't remember. Anyway, left coronary artery. So the two main ones. The left anterior descending. So this is like the big boy. This is like the very, very important one. And then the left circumflex kind of loops around the back of the posterior part, and supplies the posterior portion, the left ventricle.
Sometimes they call the left anterior descending artery the widowmaker. Because yeah, it's a bit of a dark name, but yeah.
Okay, and then there's also the coronary veins, which is referring to the system of veins which drain the heart. So the main thing you can know is this big vein called the coronary sinus. So you can kind of see it kind of goes on the back portion of the heart right there. So this is the posterior view of the heart. And it's the sinus, or like the big vein, into which the other coronary veins drain. And the coronary sinus ends up draining into the right atrium, which makes sense because the right blood drains into the right atrium, and then it goes to the right ventricle, then it goes to the lungs where it's reoxygenated. And then you've got the veins draining into coronary sinus. So left hand side of the heart. So the left side of the heart, you have the great cardiac vein. So this is actually high yield. You need to know which coronary vein matches with which artery. So the great cardiac vein drains the left side of the heart, and it follows the left anterior descending artery. So the left anterior descending artery, so that follows that artery right there. And then you have the small cardiac vein, and the small cardiac vein helps drain the right side of the heart, and that follows the right marginal artery. So it follows that artery right there, which is a branch of the right coronary artery. So you need to be able to match these arteries and veins together. And then the third main one is the middle cardiac vein, and that follows the posterior descending artery. So it follows that one right there. That's that. Yep. And coronary circulation, I kind of made this up. Coronary in health, you have, very nice, patent, compliant coronary vessels. It's able to supply the heart with all the blood it needs. But if you have disease, so if you have coronary artery disease, so if you have a lot of atherosclerosis, if you have a lot of atherosclerosis, you can end up with stiff hardening of the arteries. The arteries are not as able to supply the heart with the blood that it needs. And that's how you end up getting heart attacks. Yeah. And if your atherosclerosis progresses, so that can start causing angina. So angina, I'm sure you guys have gone through in clinical skills or whatever, is usually, stable angina is where you're, exercising or you're doing something exertional and you start getting chest pain. And that's because when you're exercising, you're doing stuff, your blood needs more oxygen because it's pumping a lot harder to get, blood to the rest of your body. But if your vessels are stiff and atherosclerosed, they are not as able to, supply with blood. So your heart starts, panicking and you get the chest pain. So just think about your cardiac system review questions. And the thing that can happen if this keeps on getting worse is your atherosclerotic plaque can rupture. If you get a plaque rupture, you'll end up with a myocardial infarction, and you'll get coronary death. So your heart will your myocardium will die, and it'll be bad. Yes, that's basically it. So there's nothing really new here. Just remember your coronary arteries. Remember the coronary veins which match with them. That's about it. Good stuff.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, cool. That's all we have for the week 11 stuff.